Welcome to today's WRR lecture with the theme Open Society, its old enemies and its new friends. Professor Ignatieff, may I ask you to come to the stage?
Thanks so much. It's a great honor to be here. If you think about what the ideal of an open society is, you kind of come with four ideas, it seems to me. The first claim is an epistemological one. Closed societies define the truth of their people. Open societies leave the determination of truth to a free process of scientific falsification. I think the second aspect of open society is a political claim, which is that closed societies favor mass coercion, single-party domination. Open societies privilege a politics that Popper called piecemeal social engineering. The third claim I think about open society is a moral claim, which is liberal societies are societies that care about individuals' retail. Individuals matter. We talk a lot about diversity and difference, but the difference that we care about morally is the difference between each of you in the room. And that the value we give to individuals is essentially the moral claim that sustains liberal democracy. The final claim is a historical claim. One of the things that open societies and liberal democracy have said for themselves with particular confidence in the 70s and 80s was that in the long run, open societies would prevail over closed ones. But there's another thing we need, I think, to say, which is open society itself has changed enormously since 1945. Now we look at a very different open society with free movement of capital, hyper-migration, hyper-connectivity, hyper-diversity, a state that is in some sense, thanks to the neoliberal revolution, less strong and interventionist than it was in 1945, much higher levels of inequality in 2017 than the wartime mobilizations in the 1940s, much more oligopoly. Open societies trying to find their bearings in their cultural space in a globalized culture. And this convulsion of change, I think, has produced within open society a deep nostalgia for the open society of the past. It's also the case that closed societies have changed enormously. If you think of the closed society of 1945, it was autarky, socialism in one country, sealed frontiers, no exit, no voice, and loyalty based on coercion. And one of the elements that I think is most difficult in thinking about the future of open society is the collusive relationship between open societies in 27 and closed societies, to a degree that we need to that pose the biggest questions in international relations and international security is whether open societies are essentially maintaining closed societies. Think about it for a minute. Open and closed societies are in a collusive, mutually dependent relationship, which poses huge questions. So these issues of collusion between open and closed societies are not usually posed, but they seem to me to be critical to the future of the international relations of liberal democracies as a whole. Another way to think about the relationship between open and closed societies is the other side of the coin, which is the ways in which closed societies are now directly intervening in our own democracies. As you know, I come from a perfect country, Canada, a country without blemish, but even we resent external human rights invigilation of some of the domestic problems we have, and that resentment at outside invigilation of open societies grows with every day, and it's not just anymore confined to closed societies. The resentment is very strong in open societies as well. And yet, there's no question that the authority of the scientific people in this room is challenged as never before. And there's another challenge as well, which relates to what I said earlier about the ways in which closed societies are manipulating our democracy, there's some challenges inside to democracy that we need to think about. You could almost ask whether open society is destroying democracy. That's a provocative question. It can't be true, but there's some element of it that is disturbingly true at the moment. If you look at what the digital revolution has done to democracy, the digital revolution is premised on openness, on frontierless digital communications. But it's having a couple of effects that we're all struggling to think about. One of them is what I would call virtual disinhibition. The other component of that, or related phenomenon, I would call algorithmic segregation. You may know it by the term filter bubbles. We're all increasingly prisoners, and we are as much prisoners as anybody else, of the bubbles of information within which we work. And this is reducing our capacity for the rough shared experience, the rough sense of common fate on which a democratic politics depends. So the very defense of an open international economy has come into question as never before. We've replaced a politics of adversaries with a politics of enemies. One of the unstated premises of democracy is someone who loses an election today could win it the day after tomorrow. And one of the geniuses of democracy is that it finds a way to handle loss. This is what I mean by the confiscation of virtue, and it is fatal to a country. It is fatal to a country because it's ultimately corrosive of the generosity, compassion, and mercy necessary to the internal cohesion of a society. So all of this, virtual disinhibition, algorithmic segregation, the attack on expertise, the weakening support for open markets, the empowerment of a politics of enemies versus a politics of adversaries, culminating in the confiscation of the virtues. We're in a tough time, folks. I sometimes think I've given you a kind of cold shower down your neck. It's not, I'm actually fiercely optimistic about the future of liberal democracy. You wouldn't know it from what I've said. But I actually think the only way to get to optimism is to look it squarely in the face and some of the problems. What do I conclude? And I really will conclude quickly. If you go back to the open society of 1945, one of the things you realize is how much Popper's vision of an open society depended on a strong sovereign state. But also strong states are states that control their borders. Again, a message from the perfect country, Canada. Our famous generosity and welcome for refugees and migrants is premised on border control. Almost to last, strong states need strong citizens. People like you, participatory, demanding, informed, difficult. They show up at meetings on rainy Thursday nights. They demand accountability. They push states to perform. They don't sit out elections. They come and vote. The culture of civic engagement and participation is crucial to a strong state. And finally, almost my last word, strong states need strong institutions. Free media, free courts, free professions, free universities. This is, it seems to me, points us in the direction of a very different vision of open society, in which open society is conditional on sovereignty, conditional on states with the capacity to enforce and defend the conditions of life for their citizens. Thank you so much for your attention.
Let me introduce Harun Shaikh to you, who will deliver our column. Thanks very much for joining us for your column. The floor is to you.
Thank you. But neither foreign nor domestic actors that promote radical beliefs are, in my view, the most formidable challenge to the open society. A more serious threat than radical belief is the gentle undermining caused by disbelief. Digital media have covered society with a thick mist of doubt. I fear it will make us cynical. Skepticism about our public institutions is the greatest threat to the open society. So my question is, can we come up with the digital equivalent of passports, speed limits, and safety belts? Thank you.
So I would first like to invite Lilian to give your opening statement. Thank you.
Conclusion from this incident is that the state did not protect anti-peace demonstrators who acted in a lawful manner. And by not acting, the government may use concern about impartiality. Government should not curb demonstration and protest too easy in the name of public order. By doing that, they maintain the status quo, which mostly favors the position of those in power. Voices of minorities might get lost in this process. Open society should protect the right of individuals to peaceful demonstrations, to freedom of speech within the boundaries of the law. Protection, however, requires in the first place some basic knowledge of human rights and of the Constitution.
I would now like to turn to Marcia Luiten to ask her for her opening words.
Thank you, Lydia. That brings me to a very, very important question, a question that also Professor Ignatieff raised, how to manage cyberspace. I think we have to dare look for rules in a new game of which we haven't set yet clear boundaries. We're now on a play field on which we are already behind. It's not about censorship, according to me. This is about 21st century warfare, soft warfare, and we need tools to defend ourselves. News has become a commercial product. And as a commercial product, it can undermine democracy. I think it's especially this business model, driven by clicks and likes and hypes and emotions, that has brought Donald Trump to power and Brexit to Europe. Can we leave the production of news, the production of facts, to the market? Or, is the question, is the production of facts a public good? Thank you very much.
So I would like to invite you to the podium as well.
And I still have the feeling that we as academia are still a bit anonymous. Of course, you can ask from society to have a bit more understanding for the knowledge of academia and that it is much more than just an opinion. But on the other hand, I think that there's a responsibility for academia itself as well to have society feel a bit different.
Let me make a negative remark and a positive remark. Let me add to the negative remark by simply saying one of the things that Alexander Herzen, the great Russian socialist, said something that Isaiah Berlin loved and I've always loved. He said, the thing we have to remember is that history has no libretto. That is, history is not a song of freedom. History is just history. And there are many routes to the future. We cannot predict with confidence that Chinese state capitalism will fail. That means we have to defend it more fiercely. But certain things do turn out to be true because we falsify, we try stuff out, and it doesn't work. We try policies, they don't work. We try pretending that climate change is not going to happen, and then we discover certain facts that seem irresistible. And that leads me to think that we don't need to believe that liberal democracy is going to be in the mist or the fog forever. Certain things prove out to be true. And Donald Trump's flagrant attempt to deny certain facts eventually, in my view, gets punished politically. The biggest single challenge to open society, we're all painfully aware of it now, is 21st century migration. Mobility of capital looked pretty good after 1989. The Netherlands has profited greatly from the mobility of capital, but nobody really likes the infinite mobility of labor. And some people are refugees, clearly driven out by persecution, torture, war, and threats of violence. I think the international regimes that sustain those populations are still intact. I think if you asked ordinary Dutch citizens, should we provide refuge, and do we have an obligation to provide refuge to someone who is in fear of violent death, torture, or is the subject of a massacre or ethnic cleansing, the answer overwhelmingly, I think, still will be yes, and will be yes across many countries. The problem is what you're calling the fortune seekers, and there, the politics of migration depends on strengthening the language of the gift. That is, what works in Canada to a limited degree, let's not go overboard here, is the idea that we can give the gift of Canadian citizenship and a path to integration to a limited number of people at our discretion, consistent with border control. And because we're a very large country, we take in, almost the equivalent of 1% of population a year, which is not, that's the other point I'd make. There's no one size fits all here. There's no one open society model. What will work in Canada will not work here. What will work in the Netherlands will not work in Hungary. That's a feature of open society we need to understand, to respect national differences, national cultures, and national particularities. But the only political way to sustain a 21st century migration policy is to speak the language of the gift, not the language of rights, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the other thing to say is that what the public will not stand is illegal migration, because then you have a sense we've lost control. That's a threat to open society. No political system can survive having a sense that the borders are out of control. So you have to establish control of your borders, and that then means something else which is difficult, which is if you find illegals in the country, they have to be repatriated. That's really tough politics, and it's very nasty politics, and it has a lot of human rights problems, which are enormous. But you can't maintain the integrity of a society without repatriation. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have to have a legal migration stream. You've got to say to Nigerians, there are 160 Nigerians who arrived in Italy last year, you've got to say to Nigeria, there's a legal migration stream into Europe, and it's this number of people. Everybody else who comes in illegally goes back home to Nigeria, right? This is the rough politics of this.
To end this part, I would like to give the floor to Professor Ernst Hirsch-Berlin, who is here as a member of the WRR, and he would like to conclude this this afternoon for you. Thank you very much.
And an open society means that requires, I emphasize here again something that was a part of what Michael Ignatieff said this afternoon, requires a constitutional structure that is able to protect the openness, the quality of openness, the free exchange of views within that society. That requires patience, a virtue that has maybe not yet mentioned this afternoon. Patient work, identifying insights, ideas. And like Corinne, I also appreciate to address not only audiences of colleagues, specialists, but also the Katholieke Vrouwengilde in Goorle. And one of the most interesting observations, in my view, in that part of Aristotle's work, is that he, and I think it has often been overlooked, that he said, in the end, the rulers and those who are ruled, the citizens, ought to have basically the same virtues. What we try to do at the Scientific Council of Government Policy, fed by the insights of the people who are gathered here this afternoon. Thank you very much.